Hi, everybody, and welcome to the fourth of our series of lectures on the art of relationships, focusing on individual artists represented in creative exchanges, the current exhibition on view at the Pollock Krasner House. I want to thank Victoria Pilato, who could not be with us today. She is the Stony Brook University Digital Projects Librarian, and Stony Brook co-hosts this series, made possible by a generous gift from Dorothy Lichtenstein and Stony Brook's John H. Marburger III Memorial Fund. Now, Creative Exchanges, which has its own website, by the way, it's creativeexchanges.org, that comprises works by artists listed in Pollock and Krasner's address books, especially those who were important to them, none more so than John Graham. Lee Krasner credited him with being the first person to recognize Pollock's artistic potential, and it was Graham who invited them to participate in the 1942 exhibition, American and French Painting, that brought them together, both professionally and romantically. And Alicia will elaborate on Graham's influence on the New York avant-garde, of which they were a part. Alicia earned her doctorate in art history from the CUNY Graduate Center, where her dissertation was on Graham. In her nearly 40-year career, first as registrar and finally as the Cullman Chief Curator at the Parrish Art Museum, she organized numerous exhibitions, including the 2017 retrospective, John Graham, Maverick Modernist, for which she wrote a major monograph on the artist. She authored many catalog and exhibition brochures for the Parrish, and her essays have appeared in several other publications on modern art. And she's now a private art consultant based in Lake Worth, Florida. Now we're going to keep everyone muted during her talk, and then we'll have Q&A afterwards. But if you have questions or comments that you want to put into the chat while Alicia is speaking, please feel free to do that. And now I will turn it over to Alicia Longwell.
Thank you, Helen. When I, read about the exhibition, I thought, oh, fingers crossed, old Graham is in there, one of the books. And of course, he does make two out of the three address books that you have, both at the Pollock Krasner House and at the Smithsonian, the archives. So thrilled when you called me, and only too happy to have the chance to go back and look at this extraordinary artist. The influence on not only Pollock and Krasner, but many, many other young artists who came within his realm when he got to New York. So with that said, you see the words "telephone me if you can," with these words scrawled on the back of a penny postcard addressed to Lenore Krasner. And by the way, in New York in those days, there were not one, but two mail deliveries a day. So it was a good way to communicate with people. The charismatic and commanding Russian-born John G. Graham invited Lee Krasner to participate in an exhibition he was organizing for the 1942 New York season. His vision was to bring together young American modernist painters whom he admired with their better-known European counterparts, such as Picasso and Braque. That he placed Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock in this worldly orbit is proof positive of Graham's campaign to promote and befriend up-and-coming young American talent. I would suggest that this project was more than self-aggrandizement, since he did include himself, and his aim was to show the achievements of American talent, and most especially these young and underknown, compared with the prevalent school of Paris. I'm sure most of you know something about the artist John Graham, and some of you probably know a great deal. But I'd like to add my own thoughts about just what made him tick, how his genuine interest in these young artists and affection for them and his enthusiasm sets him apart. His reputation as a fabulous, a prevaricator, and an out-and-out liar, I think that's a bit unfair, but having spent quite a few years thinking and writing about this artist, I took up the challenge of truthfully describing a life that I usually dismissed in the same had come to in the same few great anecdotes. And believe me, there are more than a few. But to let the work speak for itself, and to have a chronology, which I included in the 2017 monograph that Helen mentioned. And I wanted people to have a chronology on which to hang the work and all the stories. I'll give some background highlighted specifically for the ways in which he brings these two young artists, Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock, into the light. He always says that after all, he didn't start out life to be an artist. Here he is, just on the left at the Kiev Gymnasium as a young boy, 12, 13. His parents were of the minor Polish nobility. They were in Kiev because his father was in law school there. And it was important to establish this, Polish heritage, because that would come in very handy to be able to claim he was a Polish citizen at the time the First World War broke out. His birth certificate identifies him that way. And although they were only lesser Polish nobility, it really mattered. Now, Kiev is a part of Kievan Rus in the 17th century under Russian control, Lithuania and Poland post-war, post-First World War, the Ukrainian People's Republic after that, Socialist Republic, and part of the socialist organization, the Russian Socialist Soviet Republics, and then, of course, independent in 1991. Obviously, always a flashpoint between East and West, bring us to the tragic headlines of today. But that is for another day to discuss. But that is his background. It's really, as I say, this flashpoint between East and West, and he sort of subsumes all those influences. He attends the Tsarevich Page School of the Imperial Lyceum of Tsarevich Nicholas in Moscow from 06 to 08. This is the era of the great Russian collectors, of course, the wealthy textile merchants who are said to have spent more time in Paris than they did in Moscow. This is one of the things that he talked a great deal about in later life, because at that point, Shukin, and this is the Shukin collection at the Trubetskoy Palace in Moscow, Shukin opened his home every Sunday, 10 a.m., invited the intelligentsia, the art collectors, the students. It was basically an open house to come and see what he was doing. It is often said that there were more Picasso paintings in Moscow at that point than even in Paris. And this is what's so-called Picasso room. Circumstances do put Graham in Moscow at that point. They put him in a position to be an eager student and go into these. I think the story that he told Shukin that, in his opinion, Picasso was a real comer, an important artist. It really had a good eye. Shukin said, well, thank you very much, but wonder if that's true. Here you see La Danse, and yes, it is a Danse mural. Matisse was there. Shukin brought him to Paris to paint that. So, true or not, it's pretty amazing that Graham, he certainly knew of these works. I don't know if any of you had the chance to see these works, of course, after the war were divided in between the great museums in Moscow and St. Petersburg, the Hermitage in St. Petersburg and the Pushkin in Moscow, and were reunited, of course, in 2017 in Paris at the Fondation Vuitton, if you had a chance to be there and see them together. But the collection was Picasso, Degas, Matisse, Derain, and then, of course, the Van Goghs and Gauguins, and also contemporary Russian artists, Goncharova, Larionov, Malevich. I mean, it's entirely probable that Graham saw these. And I love one quote from Shukin was, if a picture gives you a psychological shock, it's a good one, buy it. Those were words to live by. Graham might have said, altered it to say, if you see something, a painting give you a psychological block, psychological shock, it's a good painting, paint it. He finished his law studies in Kiev. He went back to Kiev, and he married a young artist from a distinguished Moscow family. She went on to be a curator, actually, at the Tretyakov Museum in Moscow. War breaks out in 1914. Russia enters World War I. He goes to the Nikolaev Cavalry School in St. Petersburg, and then in 1915 joins the Gordino Hussars under Grand Duke Michael. That was the Tsar's brother. And the division was the light cavalry of the Circassian regiment of the Wild Division, so called because the Tsar sort of wanted to get rid of his wayward brother, Grand Duke Michael. And let's just say he was glad to get his wayward brother out of his care and assigned him to this 6 regiments of Muslim soldiers from the Caucasus. And in that, you can see, I can't think of a more exotic story. It happens to be true. That's the uniform alone. This is a gray Astrakhan coat. That's that Persian Persian lamb wool coat. The armored, the ivory handled dagger, and also a saber, which you can't see exactly in this picture, but hard to believe. And he was a full cavalryman. He was an extraordinary equestrian, and that will come up later. He talked often about this background in the cavalry. He talked about to young artists like Philip Pavia and the club. He talked to them about rotating your head 180 degrees when you come to the horizon, because you need to look in all angles about approaching the enemy approach. And he transposed that into painting as well. And if you're looking out, both physically and psychologically, to do this full examination of what you're doing. So at the October Revolution in 1918, he's back in Moscow. Just left us a minute. He was imprisoned. He was able to prove his Polish identity. We're going to lose the first wife along this upheaval. Second wife, a young woman, that he was actually boarding in the house where she lived with her father, who was an uncle. And her uncle were prominent in the White Russian army. He decided they would get out of the situation they were in. They went south to the Black Sea, got a ship. This is over the better part of 2 years. Got a ship through Romania, back up through Warsaw. Finally went due west, got a creaky old freighter out of Antwerp, landed in New York in Thanksgiving Day, 1920, with a young wife and the new baby, Vera. This is a point when Graham tried to get work as a diplomat or something using his skills in language and his background in the law. No go, he couldn't find any kind of job. He and Vera took a position as she was a governess to a family in Rye, New York, a wealthy family. She taught the girls French. He taught the boys riding, how to be an equestrian. And it was at this point that Graham said to himself, this is not the life for me. He went to New York, fortunately abandoning Vera, but things turned out all right for her. He enrolled at the Art Students League, and it was a question of never in his whole life did he think it would be possible for him to be an artist. He'd had that feeling since childhood. He was a very adept draftsman, he knew, but he was trained in the military and the law. He was expected to do that, and that's what he did. He saw a chance to change that. And he enrolled at the Art Students League in 20, and now that's John Sloane's evening class. On the right, Sloane is at the bottom on the left. He developed a great friendship with Sloane, who was a very prominent American painter at that time. Sloane had great affection for Graham. Sloane's, you can't make a living at art, but you can have a life worth living. And Graham really took those words to heart, and that's what he would quote Sloane often to younger artists. This is a painting he did there. I'm going to maybe fill in some captions here. It's a Graham from 1922. Sloane actually purchased this, and it was in his collection on his death and went to the Delaware Museum. But obvious influences of Picasso, Braque, Cubism, School of Paris, but a very beautiful painting, well composed. Sloane certainly thought so. Also in the class, Sloane's class, were Barnett Newman, Adolf Gottlieb was in that Sloan class. Alexander Calder, seen here in Calder's studio. That's a wire head that a portrait that he did of Graham. And then at the bottom is a little hard to see drawing, a female nude that Graham did. And Calder wrote that it was amazing to see that Graham could start at the top with two different pencils, a red and a blue, go down and do a whole drawing with both hands and complete it at the bottom. He soon became, Graham was appointed a monitor for Sloan, which was a great privilege for that class. The monitor apparently got to go in early, set up the chairs, set the pose of the model, and also take the position they put their easel at the point they wanted. They had the great vantage point, then went out and had numbers in a hat and let the other students draw from the hat as to where they would sit in the pecking. So he was pretty high in the pecking order at the Art Students League. He was at least a generation, sometimes a generation, half generation, but mostly a whole generation, 20 years older than most of the artists there. And he had a way of, well, I'll say commanding, but always interested in people, always interested. And Barney Newman turns up everywhere across the biography too. They were great friends. Speaking of friends in high places, Sloan introduced him to one Frank Crowninshield. That at that point, Crowninshield was an editor of Vogue, was a great friend of Condé Nast, and not Nasty, Condé Nast. And Nast said, "You're working for Vogue, come to me, take over Vanity Fair, make it a bigger, better publication." And this was from 1909. And after that, he had asked, so he was at Vogue for a long time, and then did go to revamp Vanity Fair. He asked Graham, whom he had met through Sloan as early as 1920, what would be good? And Graham said, well, people want to see people in that. They want to see other people. They want to see what's going on in art and literature and history. So he took Graham's advice. They remained very close friends. This is some years later on the left, beautiful portrait photograph by Doris Ullman of Crowninshield. That's a photogravure. He elevated the publication, particularly by its own printing. They were beautiful. Some were photogravures in there. He did fashion photography by Steichen. Vanity Fair was completely different. Crowninshield is unfortunately most associated with having fired Dorothy Parker, but in his defense, Parker was alienating most of the theater advertisers because of her bad reviews she was giving. So there's the group at the round table. Am I the only person who didn't know Harpo Marx sat at the Algonquin round table? Did anyone ever know that? Pretty sure. Anyway, that's Marx. That's Harpo, and Dorothy Parker, Alexander Walcott. Anyway, these were the famous wags of New York who did talk about Crowninshield, but in his defense, he couldn't retain Miss Parker, who went on to fame and at the New Yorker. But it would be hard to. Crowninshield was someone for whom the word urbane would have been invented if it hadn't already been a word. So. This is basically what he did for Graham. He crops up everywhere. He's making contacts for Graham. He tries to get him on the WPA. He has Graham head up a collection of African art. This was from 1923 at the Whitney Studio Club. You were just beginning to see this idea of juxtaposing early, Picasso's paintings with this is a reliquary, and that juxtaposition of African art and Picasso and Braque and other European painters that were being collected. Now, Graham had the idea, and we'll see as he begins to go to Paris, of collecting. This was the great center for African art collecting. Of course, it came up from West Africa right into France. Paul Guillaume, who is in fact the man who loaned everything, the Parisian collector for the show, he was in fact the first person Graham would look up when he decided he would do some African art collecting in France, and he actually formed a major collection for Frank Crowninshield, who was a founder, also a founding trustee of the Museum of Modern. So friends in high places is what Graham had. This is a man who kept up with him, who wrote to Graham saying, what am I going to get you this year for Christmas every year? Anyway, his wife number 3, beautiful Eleanor Graham. She was a young student at the Art Students League. A talented artist herself, though, of course, one of those stories that nothing much remains of what she did. She was from Baltimore. She was had a very solid family background. Her father, I would say, was like the E. Power Biggs of his day. He was a brilliant and well-known organist. He also invented those player piano, the Aeolian rolls that you could have your own play sort of music from that. He became a very, very wealthy man. He had an apartment in New York, so they were able to use that. But at a point, they went back to finishing study. They moved to Baltimore. Graham sort of didn't really know what to expect in Baltimore. Thought of as somewhat provincial at that point. This was where they lived at 15 East Pleasant Street. And there was a newly forming group called Friends of Art, and they joined. They were only too happy. They hosted meetings in their apartment there on East Pleasant. And, you know, of course, 2 other members of the Friends of Art were Dr. Clarabelle Cohn and her sister, Miss Etta Cohn. Now, that's another nice connection for him as well. Graham also has the habit of, when he wants to sort of compliment or pay homage to someone and ingratiate himself, quite honestly, he will sketch and give them the sketch. This is his sketch of Dr. Clarabelle Cohn. As you know, about in 1900, the family, actually, Miss Etta sort of started the collecting by one of her brothers gave her $300 to sort of spruce up the father's apartment. She went out and bought a whole bunge of Theodore Robinson, who's sort of American Impressionist. And they sort of got the collecting and installing bug from that. But she went on to collect in Paris. They went, after 1900, Dr. Cohn sort of retired. She was a research pathologist, head of the Women's Medical Board in Baltimore. But she decided to sort of give that up and go on. She and Graham were actually approximately the same age, which is unusual for him to run into people his age. They were great friends. Anyway, they came to Paris. They often went to Paris, came back, collected, came back and installed all the work. This is the apartment of theirs in Baltimore, of the Cohn sisters. And then it's a very interesting moment when there's a letter from Etta to actually Dr. Clarabelle, in which she says, I took your advice, or a letter to her from Eleanor Gibson, who had also been in Paris. And she lets her sister know that Eleanor, taking their advice, began to pick up some things for them in Paris, some jewelry, some African jewelry, which they wanted to see. This is some of it displayed at the Baltimore Museum in a show. I think this looks like it's in the archive drawer. But the Cohns, then they did buy 2 paintings, buy 2 very beautiful paintings. This is the landscape near Beaucaire in 26, and another still life with the same picture from him. It's interesting that paintings were paid back. Apparently, Graham, who was perpetually short of money, asked to borrow some money when he saw Dr. Clarabelle in Paris. So she reminded him, lots of notes. She kept immaculate notes, and she reminded him how the paintings would pay her back for the money she had loaned him. But you run into this very close relationship between these very important people. They also had important friends, as you know. Gertrude and Clarabelle were sort of girlhood friends in Baltimore when Stein's family moved back there at one point. But and also at that, he started to collect he also would bring back these beautiful volumes, Curator, which was organized by a man named Christian Zervos, and had these beautiful reproductions of European art, something. And every time he was, Graham was very happy to go to, as long as he has the Cone patronage, to go to Paris every year. So he would bring back this volume. He would really sit and with young artists show him beautiful photo reviewers, beautifully printed books, magazines, and they came out several times throughout the course of the year. This one is in fact from 39, a bit later. But you can see the quality. And this is another way in which Graham was always really instructing. At heart, he was something of a teacher. He, the next big influence to enter his life and really sort of affect the way he approached other artists as well was Duncan Phillips. This is Duncan about the turn of the century, and on the left, it's his father seated and his older brother, James, on the right. I'm sure you know about, my point is that Duncan established the Phillips Memorial, as he called it, art gallery, in memory of his father, who passed away in 1917, as well as his brother James the next year succumbed to the Spanish flu. So he was grief stricken. His impulse was to take, the family was a wealthy family, and his notion to make this museum a memorial to those two. And also he firmly felt that art could bring you joy, art could bring you peace, art could bring you solace. He's one of the first people to collect Rothko in this country. And that's what he did. That's his wife, Marjorie, who may well have been known to Graham and Eleanor when, and she also studied at the Art Students League. He and Marjorie took a real interest in Graham, and in fact in Eleanor as well, and as them being a family. Duncan was very avuncular with Graham, always giving him advice. He had something Duncan wanted to experiment in that museum. He wanted to show different things. He liked the idea of Graham being an immigrant. He said bringing that Slavic influence into his art, but being a true American by this time, Graham had obtained American citizenship. So Duncan Phillips wanted also to think of him as an American painter, and he stressed that over and over again, particularly when Graham always was asking him for money or to have a stipend. This is probably the most famous painting that they collected, this Renoir, the voting party. It's the censure of the Phillips collection. And they were just, as I say, people who took a real interest in the artists they collected. One might say a bit too much of an interest, but he's too much directing the artist. But, Graham was only too willing to accept that because Phillips did agree to a stipend. He promptly went to, he begged him, he said, I must go to Paris. Duncan was skeptical, but that's all right. He went to Paris. He landed there in 1928. He had been in some previous summers, but this was for an extended period. This was, as I said, underwritten by the money from Phillips. He took a house right near the La Rotonde. He was in Montparnasse. He had a studio just around the corner off the Boulevard Raspail at Rue Vigan, and not far from another American painter who came for that summer, one Stuart Davis. Here's Davis, famously his only trip abroad that summer to Paris. He had rented Jan Matulka, was another painter you may have heard of, also taught at the Art Students League. He rented Matulka's apartment on the Rue Vercingetorix. I know that needs an accent in there somewhere. And he painted Paris. There's no one else who painted Paris with this distinctly American touch, you might say. A whole suite of wonderful paintings. He took two egg beaters that was really Juliana Force at the Whitney Studio Club, had really given him the money to go. He loved it. He wrote to his mother that you could sit all day at the rotund and have a cafe creme and no one bothered you and play cards. He did a lot more work than that, producing a big collection of paintings. He was there over a year. And this, he and Graham became great friends that summer. They worked on it at the print atelier together. And as you can see, Graham's Rue Brea there on the left is strongly influenced by what he saw Davis doing. Also the Harlequin in gray on the right. Both of these going to the Phillips collection because, of course, that was the deal, was to send paintings back. Also collect African art for him. And then he really had this lasting friendship, with Davis, who thought the world of him. And Phillips was very happy to have these paintings that kept coming back over them. Although he did have a feeling that he might get too Frenchified, he might fall too much under the influence of Picasso, as you can well see in Harlequin. Picasso was a god for Graham. It was the painter he most admired. And that will change here in the course of his life. But at this moment, Picasso was sort of the beginning of the end of where it all met. He also says he visited Picasso's studio. I dare say he did. It's pretty much open house. But back in New York after that, and he did come back, sort of touch base. He thought it was important to keep up the New York connections, and he was right. There's Arshel Gorky, of course. They were sort of neighbors in the downtown set. And on the right is Gorky and a young Bill de Kooning. They had sort of studios near each other at one point. That's Gorky's the studio. And he became very good friends with Gorky. In fact, he had an idea that he would sort of style himself and Davis and Gorky as sort of a triumvirate of American painters, new young American painters. He wrote to, this is in 1930, after another visit in Paris, he said to Phillips, Davis and Stuart Davis, he said, Stuart Davis and Gorky and I have formed a group, and something purely American is coming out from under our brushes. Now, this is very interesting since he could have gotten a job, obviously, on Madison Avenue. He's styling himself as sort of in the middle between Davis, the quintessential American painter, and Gorky, of course, the emigre from, at that point, Gorky called himself Russian, but he was in fact from Armenia, had fled after the Great Holocaust there. But Graham talked to this as about forming a group for painting in many similar ways, as you see here with Gorky's one of his nighttime mystery and enigma. At this point, Phillips wasn't buying it. He said, especially since Graham had abandoned Eleanor 6 weeks from the due date of the baby that they were expecting. He looked very askance on that. As sort of Phillips' support fell away, Graham took to dealing in African art much more earnestly. He collected a big collection for Helena Rubinstein as well. He and Eleanor sort of parted ways, although they never did really. And he found himself less painting and more writing. He had written for many years and kept notes. The System and Dialectics of Art was published in 1937, maybe for another day to go into that. But this was his advice to younger painters. It was questions asked and questions answered, which of course he always said a painting is a question asked and a question answered. The big takeaway was abstraction, that every painting, every work of art is an abstraction, because even what's called a two-dimensional work that you hang on a wall is in fact in the third dimension, because nothing is totally flat. So everything, in a way, every painting is an abstraction of life. But then he also worked on an article called Primitive Art in Picasso. And this, who we learned actually from Robert Motherwell, this was an article, and it was in the Magazine of Art, that Pollock, I don't know if he had the whole magazine, maybe he tore out the article, had in his back pocket and carried around. He was so taken by what Graham was saying about primitive art, um, and the influence of Picasso, but how the primordial uh, import of primitive art is what we should all be, that sort of spontaneous reaction in a way. And this is once over lightly, folks, at this moment, but and Jungian psychology as well. This is where the ideas should come from, this wellspring that's innate in all of us, but we get too civilized to notice. He was one of the first people really to pick up on cyclic art. And here you see the opening page with all the chapters. It's very sort of like a question answer dialogue, but he wanted to make definitions. He wanted young artists to be able to know what sort of those big highfalutin words that critics were throwing at them. He thought, you guys and women, you'd best learn what all these things mean. And it's about this time that certainly Pollock knows Graham, knows who he is, and they do have meetings. He also crosses paths with one Lee Krasner. Here she is at the 31st Street Pier, which Helen explained to me. I asked, what was that pier? That was a pier that the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, was had spaces for artists to work. And here she is at that pier with someone maybe had put an impromptu sculpture there. But I love this photograph. It's like that. Inquiring minds will figure out. She was someone with whom he was very, very close over the years, more so than Pollock. This is Gainsport #1, which is in the Metropolitan. This is the kind of painting she was doing, looking in a way not unlike some of the things that Graham was doing. And this is this mural study, which you might have seen in the exhibit at the Kasman Gallery a few years back now. But she, on the she was in the mural section for a while. This is actually apparently studies for a mural that Bill de Kooning started and didn't finish, but it was ultimately never done. Graham signed up for it. Of course, he got Frank Crowninshield to put on some pressure and get him signed up, but that didn't go so well. He was horrified by the questionnaires that regularly came and said, how's your work? How's it progressing? What are you working on? What are you painting? And he said, I'm not a machine. He wrote back to, I think this was under Juliana Force, whom he had, already broken up with or offended. Not hard to imagine. He called the Whitney Club an old maids group. And he didn't get very well with that. He sort of fell out and never really was paid for anything. And quite rightly so, he never did anything. But this was what was going on in New York at that time, where many of the artists based on were working on things for the WPA. And a couple of great pictures of Krasner about this time. Now, Pollock, we know for a fact that in 1941, Graham took him. He said we should go see this Indian painting at the Museum of Modern Art. Had been organized by René Darnancourt, who all along. Oh, Alfred Barr was also, he brought Grandma Moses to the Museum of Modern Art. There were exhibitions like this. There were great interest and not. Graham didn't present this as an ethnographic moment, but there are people who know more about Pollock than I, who have often commented on the fact that this sand painting, which as you can see, two of the Native Americans were engaged in working on a sand painting there in the lobby. Of course, it looks rather like but it did keep people from getting in their way, I have to say. And that's probably René Darnancourt, who was very tall there with no doubt a group of donors. But Graham took him. He said, we need to go see this show at the Museum of Art. And as I say, many authorities have thought this really might have changed in many ways Pollock's thinking about the way of painting. And now, in 1941, the penny postcard to Lee Krasner talked about this show he was organizing. It was at the Macmillan, sometimes called the Macmillan Gallery. It was actually Macmillan Inc. Now, this was they know the term, a very well-known decorating firm in the decorating district there in the 50s. Crown and Shield was, of course, a great, great friend of Mrs. Macmillan. And he had there was sort of a room that was often given over exhibitions in the space there for her headquarters. And Graham had done a show of the collection, African art collection he had organized for Crown and Shield. And he obviously, Crown and Shield was instrumental in getting the space for Graham to be able to curate, you can let's say, this show, which was French and American painters, and had Picasso, Braque, Derain, Segenzac in Europe. He brought them down in 1942. So just into January 1942. So he was sort of organizing this all the time that he was first meeting Pollock and Krasner, who had not met themselves at that point. We don't know Krasner's painting, although it was between Matisse and Braque, so she was enormously happy. It's hard to believe well, as Bill de Kooning said, it was a little show, in many ways it was. There was not a whole lot of publicity about it, not a whole lot of people saw it. It was not really written about by the critics. So no wonder that we know so little. De Kooning was in it, Pollock, Krasner, Stuart Davis, Graham himself, a woman who'd been Bill de Kooning's girlfriend back in the 30s, but and hadn't really painted that much since then. But we do know that Jackson Pollock's birth was in the show, just painted 1941. Now, do I have I'm sorry, I don't have the slide of this, but you can see this Eskimo mask. This is the cover page of Primitive Art in Picasso, this Eskimo pass. You can see these forms, which are quite similar to some of the forms in Birth. I think that's, not hard to discern, and to think that that introduction by Graham had a real influence on Pollock at this period. I included this portrait sketch he did of Krasner because it's so, again, he would love to sketch people while they were together or having a drink or a tea, and then sort of present that. And there's that, like that one of Krasner. Now, at this point, he lived on Greenwich Avenue. Sad to say, he and Eleanor had parted. He also was married to a woman in Constance Wellman, who actually he met in Crown and Shield's office, another huge influence there of Crownie, as he was called. She was a very smart young woman. She also had great sort of organization and skills. She had worked, as a secretary there in the Condé Nast offices, but she helped get both those publications, certainly the Systems and Dialectics of Art, organized into a printer. That was a tremendous help in the later 30s. They parted ways, but somewhat acrimoniously. And he moved to Greenwich Street in the West Village, or Greenwich Avenue. And seen here is that apartment. Now, this is one that Lee Krasner would often visit. She commented on all the fabulous things he had in the apartment. And also that if he was having a tea, it was a Russian tea with a huge samovar. And she was incredibly impressed by the effort and that he would go to have a young artist like herself. You may be noticing something of a change in his style, which is very true. Often he would often don a costume, or not much of a costume at all. He was known for being bare-chested when he was at home. He was also known for having a loincloth, and he was apparently an incredible yoga enthusiast, which apparently kept him in remarkable shape. Well, I mean, he never looked much older than the people who were 20 years younger than him. But here he is in full regalia on the left, but again, sort of around the house, he would wear a wrap skirt and bare chested, but looks comfortable. In 1945, Pollock and Krasner married, probably because they were moving to Springs, and as we know, maybe a little more propriety was called for there in Springs. So they admittedly saw less of New York. If they didn't know, once they got there, and this gentleman still had his horse and buggy to move around. And there, upper right, they are within a Margaret Holmes essay for a magazine with Tino Nivola there, Barnes grocery. They saw less, certainly, of Graham. Krasner would meet him more often. He and Pollock sort of would have been 1949. Is he the greatest American painter, greatest painter in the United States? That could have sort of, affected Graham to read this. He could have been overjoyed for his young protege, so to speak, or maybe not. I leave the cover there of Life magazine to show you the sort of contrast between this and to Fairfield County there. It's credited everywhere as being Debbie Reynolds. And of course, Helen corrected this for me. I thought that didn't look much like Debbie Reynolds. It's a Deborah Reynolds, who was actually just a model hired to put on a straw hat and look like a Fairfield County housewife. So the contrast between this and Pollock seems quite amazing. And here's a wonderful photograph of Elaine. They'd all gone to sort of a higher plane, as Bill de Kooning, Jackson Pollock, Lee Krasner, all these, and that is Dorothy Miller there standing facing them. That's, of course, Elaine de Kooning also on the left. All these things Graham may have felt somewhat left behind. Also, he at that point met Mariana Strata. She was, if I may say, not exactly what he had thought of as his type, which was for much younger women. She was not. She was approximately his age. She, in fact, she and her husband, Michael Strata, and her daughter, Ileana Sonnabend, who at that time was Ileana Castelli. And you need that name certainly from Sonnabend's distinguished career as a gallerist. They had a townhouse at 4 East 77. She and Michael were, her husband, were somewhat estranged, but she met Graham. They had a long and over 12 years together. She's often called his fifth wife. I don't think they ever married. I think she, as improprietous as that sounds for Southampton at that point, in which she bought a house. You see it there, lower right, 220 South Main, which puts them just down the block from Fairfield Quarter. But she bought that house there. They traveled extensively. I think it was a wonderful, somewhat separated from New York. They traveled. The Castellis, her daughter, and Castelli opened a gallery on the fourth floor of the townhouse. This address, 4077. And so a whole new chapter started in that era. But he and Mariana were very happy. Ileana said the other daughter wasn't too fond of Graham, but Ileana felt that they had a wonderful time. She said the house was like a Russian dacha country house, and he painted some, not so much. His style had changed radically. I think most of us have heard about this sort of radical style that came in the early 50s. He turned to painting more what was often called classic paintings or paintings of women. This is sort of the vernissage at the for the Pinacoteca Gallery in New York, but this was the Arnold Constable, great women's clothing store on Fifth Avenue, which he showed the paintings to. At that point, he had, of course, totally turned on Picasso. He, in fact, something called the case of Mr. Picasso, decried, called him a phony, a hoax. I've returned to the original. Graham had said that he had turned to the original. The sort of the art community sort of backed off after this. In fact, at that opening night at the Pinacoteca Gallery, when the windows in the big department store were first opened as well, and there was a great crowd at the gallery to welcome him, all his friends and admirers, and he was in the back. They had a mimeograph machine. He was running off copies of the case of Mr. Picasso to distribute. And it was Barney Newman who came back and said, John, don't do this. And they had known each other since, our Students' League. Don't do this. Your friends are gathered here. You shouldn't be back here. And got him out back into the opening. And of course, he later mailed this to everyone. So that's kind of a point where people started to sort of turn away from the former, who's almost a guru really in the art world, Philip Pavia, who of course found the sculptor who founded the club, talked about him as being such an influence, and that they would all sit in Washington Square Park and really listen to Graham. He made them feel that being an artist was a very serious business and that we worked hard at it. So this sort of apostasy and turning on Picasso was, people didn't know what to make of it. But he sort of retreated from a more public life, which was fine because he still was with Marion. This is a very funny, this summer of 1953, Leo Castelli, Mariana's son-in-law, has a house in Georgica, and he invites young painters. He decided he would invite a young painter couple. We have invited Willem de Kooning, Elaine, although they were somewhat strange at that point. Elaine came along for the summer as well. But the fact is that Mariana, never clever, decided to rent out the Southampton house, and he and Graham took sort of a room over the garage there in Georgia and happily spent this. I don't know how Castelli felt about that, or Ileana for that matter, but they were there. They were at all the parties. This is in fact a cocktail party, which would make a great exhibition because there's sort of a panoramic view of, and Helen's done a lot with Tony Vaccaro, wonderful, wonderful photographer. But he happened to be at this cocktail party and takes a sort of a panoptic view of everyone there. Well, everybody that was anybody was there, East Hampton to Southampton, except for Pollock and Krasner. At any rate, you see Graham there. That's Harold Rosenberg, well-known critic, a great proponent of Bill de Kooning, who is there. Graham, as I say, seems sort of happy in this new era he has made for himself. Paul Brock, who he and Miriam Shapiro, his wife, were the artist couple invited the next season to Castelli, always said that Graham was the first to wear this Lacoste shirt, this blue collared sports shirt, in which he's sporting right there. And this is one of his great Head of a Woman from 1954. Sometimes there are mystical overlays there about, you've no doubt heard about the cross-eyed women, which I don't know, sometimes I think rather too much is made of that. But here, her eyes aren't even crossed. He was an incredible draftsman, as you can see, he always was. And he went back to this style of painting with great gusto. There he is again with, I'm sorry, that's the same picture, but I love this. This is it's in Georgia at the house, but he has taken Cecilia with him. I mean, it's the kind of thing you wouldn't leave with the renters, right? So he's taken his painting there. This is sort of after 55, Mariana sadly passes away. She puts in her will, another reason I think they weren't married, because she refers to her very good friend, John Graham. She also, with propriety about being in Southampton, does indeed call herself Mrs. Graham, but that's not what it says on her tombstone, which is in Little Edgewood Cemetery in Bridgehampton. She was buried there, as was Michael Strata. But she said in her will that there should always be an apartment for John at the 4 East 77th Street. And in fact, when he got there, Ileana said, John, you're going to have the basement here, apartment. This is the little stairs down to the below ground. I don't think it's even an English basement, but he happily, well, I don't know happily, but he lived there. That was his New York pied a terre. He was basically couldn't afford to travel at that time. This is one of his last great paintings. It's self-portrait of a warrior from 58. Now, Fitz Bolton, another painter who was at the Art Students League, great friends with Graham and also Krasner, writes about going to visit him there, that he was as ever ebullient. He greeted them in a loincloth, and he was bare to the waist and had some kind of Turkish headdress on. And Boltman described the rat gray paint and the sort of hideous pipes and quite a dismal place, but he said John was able to just light it up. The next few years he really spends in London. He eventually dies there in 61. But this is the end of my slides. How am I doing? Oh, goodness, sorry. That went overly long. Sorry. Helen, you should have given me a high sign there. But this is, my take on how he influenced younger artists, particularly Pollock and Krasner, with whom he was close. And even there at the end, Krasner, and I did forget to mention that fateful summer that in 56, when Krasner trying to persuade Pollock to go abroad with her, neither of them had ever been abroad. And so he wouldn't go. She said, all right, I'm going. A letter she wrote in July to Pollock, in which she said, saw John Graham. We went to the flea market together in Paris today. That was sweet. She never knew, of course, if Pollock had read it. By the time it got there, he, of course, in the fatal accident in August. So that was one of the last. He was in Paris at the time. Krasner got the news and came right back home. That's sort of the denouement to that. Any questions? I'd be delighted to try and chats, or should I look, Helen? Are you looking?
I'm looking. I don't see anything in the chat. But if anyone would like to raise their hand, I will unmute you, or you can unmute yourselves. I think I don't think there's a restriction on that, but I did have a question to sort of get the ball rolling. When Graham started collecting so-called primitive art, were there any restrictions or problems about his bringing these things into the country, or was there really no, none of what we think of today as this kind of misappropriation of
Right.
primitive or indigenous art?
As far as I know, it was not any problem. He would,
Go to the flea market, right?
Right.
And buy, yeah.
Well, he would have whole crates packed up in Paris and shipped. He basically dealt with the Parisian dealers, who, of course, dealt with the West African colonies, and that was the predominant art that everyone collected. As far as African art, of course, it's much more widespread and wonderful than that. But that was the view then. I never ran across anything. He seems to have traveled very freely. Collecting for others, bringing back things on spec, and that was an income. He also had some oceanic and other things, which I assume he would have gotten in New York too, or maybe in Paris, because the colonies there. But I never encountered that. Really didn't. Seem to be pretty free. Or unencumbered. As long as he could carry it, he could bring it or ship it.
I'm just looking to see if we have any questions.
Alicia,
Yes, Mike.
hey, his later stance on anti-Picasso, was there any relationship in the content of that to kind of, how later on people kind of got to be anti-Picasso in a different way? Even was there some relationship between the two, or was it more a personal gripe, or what was the content?
Well, I don't know. It seems to me it's just more sort of personal, maybe. I mean, the fact that, people were still, Picasso at that point, was still getting up every day and making art. And
Yeah.
maybe he thought it was just plain old not fair.
Oh, so it was more personal then.
I think it was personal. Yeah. I mean, of course, he had been his major, proponent. I mean, he adored Picasso. I mean, it was Picasso and art. I mean, his admiration was complete, but somewhere, I don't know, it could have been, I want to throw around the term psychotic break, but he just, I think he just maybe just thought, well, make room for me too.
I see.
And he really kind of went on.
Stretch.
Yeah, but then, I mean, Gorky was also enamored with Picasso and imitated Picasso and then went on to make it his own. And Graham certainly wasn't so beholden to Picasso that anyone would assume that he was just copying him. It just seems such an odd turnabout in 180 degrees.
Well, I don't know. It's copying. I mean, I think it's just almost think, how does anybody get past this guy? He's still, he's still selling. So this is what collectors want. It's still Picasso. The man is still Picasso. I've never read that much about everybody. Just, I don't know. Everybody sort of backs away from the thing that he would just write the screed and be in the back, mimeographing it to pass out, which is documented, throughout.
Like over the top kind of rejection where, somebody like Pollock says, oh, that guy did it all, how can I do better? And then you try to do better or try to do different and overcome Picasso, as Clement Greenberg put it, after learning from him.
Yeah. I mean, of course, the reception for his work, this new style was also very meager. So that sort of fueled, I mean, even before the Pinacoteca, that sort of fueled, everything about his disappointment. Although I will say at that time, he was certainly comfortable in life due to Mariana.
Right.
Hard to figure.
Well, if we have no more comments or questions, I just want to thank you so much for giving us real insights into Graham's background and you can see how all of these different influences led him to where he eventually wound up, but definitely out in left field in terms of the development of American art. He took a very strange turn, but he obviously had a huge impact on the younger artists coming up in the 1940s. Right. And so for that, if nothing else, we'll thank him, and we'll thank you so much for being with us. And also, of course, for Mike, next week, get ready, it's your turn. And we will see you all next week, I hope. Thank you so much for being here. Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thank you, Alicia. It was very charming as usual.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Alicia.